In today's episode, we welcome Alfredo Rivera. Alfredo, CFO of WizeLine, is a seasoned professional with experience in the field of finance and technology. His career spans almost 2 decades in leadership positions. Alfredo has started his career as an investment banker working with Fortune 500 companies. Most recently, Alfredo joined WizeLine, a global technology services provider, as the leader of finance and accounting. Alfredo graduated from Yale University with a BA in economics and completed an MBA from Georgetown. Alfredo, welcome to the Mentors Office podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It is really great to have you here. And, well, Alfredo, we want to know more about your career. And the first question is, when did you realize that you wanted to become a CFO?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, growing up, I was naturally kind of inclined to numbers. I think, I started my career as an undergrad doing pre-med. My dad's a doctor, so I thought, I would follow in his footsteps. Shortly after, I realized that while sciences were interesting, and I was good at it, it wasn't necessarily what I was passionate about. And I realized that for me, numbers really spoke to me. So I kind of decided, back then when you're about 20, 21, and you're trying to decide what career you want to pursue, I thought investment banking, kind of a career in finance, was really something that was calling out to me. Of course, as you progress and you start actually, doing the work, graduated, started doing investment banking, I started to realize that working at a company, not just advising a company, but working at a company was something that I thought was really valuable. And more importantly, something that was very rewarding. So about 5 or so years ago, I'd actually decided finally, after over a decade of doing strategic work, right, advising work, being that outsider that gets brought in for specific situations, I decided to dive in and join my first kind of startup. So I joined a tech startup here in New York City. I was employee number 3 back then of the finance and accounting org. So it was the CFO back then, a controller, and myself. I was heading all the FP&A, kind of the finance side of it. The company itself was about 230 employees, so not too big, very much early stages, but we were hyper growth, right? Hyperscalers. We went from 230 within 2 years. We were at above 1,000 employees. Our revenue was skyrocketing. And it was during this time that I met someone that I believe to be my mentor, which was the CFO at that point at Own Backup, someone that's still a friend, and more importantly, someone that I, every so often I reach out for advice more than anything as I'm, navigating this role myself. But I saw the impact that a good strategic financial leader can really add to a company, and that's kind of how I set myself kind of that idea that I would hopefully, one day. Was going to actually, be able to take that seat and be a CFO.
So it was later on your career. It was not like a dream as a kid or anything. It was later on that you formed that goal.
Yeah, I think at least, where I grew up and kind of even my undergrad education, investment banking is kind of that golden child. That's where a lot of people, if you want to do finance, you go into investment banking. The reality is that, at least for me, right? I don't want to say that this is for everybody, but while investment banking is a great training ground, it gave me a lot of the technical work, right? The modeling, the numbers, the really understanding of financials, stuff like that. I didn't really see the rewarding part of it. And by that, I mean, I don't think I was necessarily making an impact. It was only after that I transitioned and actually went in-house, so to speak, right? And actually worked in a finance department that I started to see the valuable work that you could actually accomplish. And sure, I joke around with my friends nowadays. I used to work 100, 120 hours a week when I was in investment banking.
Oh.
I can probably say that at this point at WiseLine, I am probably doing, close to those 100 hours a week. But the reward is so
But as
much better.
CFO, right?
Yes, as CFO. As CFO now. Yeah, as a CFO. And I think, I do see the value in the work that I'm doing.
Very interesting. And yeah, that's always a question that I've had. If you want to get to a high position, an important role, should you have like a really long plan, like a long-term plan since you're a kid, or how does that work? That and it's interesting, right? Because for many people, it's like something really long-term. They always wanted that, and for some others, it's more like on the on their path. They go discovering that really. So it's really interesting. And I don't know if you can
Yeah.
tell us more about the story of how did you become Wiseline's CFO?
Yeah, that is quite the interesting story. So, about almost 2 years ago, right, I was pursued by a headhunter here in the US. WiseLine was looking for a senior director of FP&A. Mostly, I think they wanted someone with a little bit of my background, right, that technical aspect, the ability to hopefully help shape and reform or reshape part of the org. Back then I found it super interesting, right? I've always, right, like I'm Puerto Rican, so I always kind of that gray area between being Hispanic and also, part of the US. It's always kind of something that I've struggled. My career itself, right? I moved to the US when I was 18. I did all my undergrad, all my studies, and I've been working in the US since then. And when I was approached by the headhunter with the opportunity at Wiseline, I thought it was super interesting, right? The ability to hopefully, I don't want to say take a part of me that I had never necessarily leveraged, but being able to work at a company that had such strong Latin American influence, being able to, right? I thought that was something that for me piqued my interest right off the bat. So I gave it a chance. I went through the recruiting process, even had to interview with the board at that point, but got the job and joined Wizeline. Back then, of course, we were undergoing some serious hurdles. We had, certain financial situations that we were dealing with our banks and whatnot. But I found the work extremely interesting. I think, with Andres kind of joining last year, I think I was thankfully given the opportunity to step into this role in an intermediate position, right? It was initially I was supposed to be interim, and the idea was that hopefully, and everybody was very clear, right? Andres, I respect him a lot, but from the get go, set expectations with me, and it was really good. I think what ended up happening, hopefully, and this is, I mean, it's still to be seen, but I think I was able to gain the trust of the board more than anything, and the rest of e-staff, and slowly was able to kind of grow into that role. And actually, about, I would say, Q4 of last year, I was, basically informed that they were no longer looking for a permanent solution or a permanent kind of replacement for the CFO. And they were going to give me the opportunity to kind of step into that role and hopefully perform not just as interim, but now as the full-time CFO.
Very interesting story, and congratulations.
Thank
Also,
you.
it is a very recent position.
Yes.
And well, I want to now dive into your expertise in finance. And I think that something that's not really easy, and especially for people that are not that specialized in finance, is to try to understand how to balance between funding new projects and maintaining fiscal responsibility in a company. Like, what can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and something that I think wise in itself, right? As we go and as we're building this year, specifically when we're thinking about initiatives and kind of where do we invest and where do we deploy our capital, something that, e-staff and a lot of the senior leadership is constantly kind of debating more than anything, right? Trying to come up with a structure, a framework more than anything. The reality is, at least for me, right? And I've tried to say this, right, in the town halls and whenever I have conversations with Wizeliners, is we are coming from a point in time where, of course, we were a little bit not frugal enough, and by that I mean we were, spending more than we were able to really fund. So for me, our current state at Wiseline is really about being fiscally responsible, right? Really thinking about, okay, are we seeing that top line growth? Are we seeing those kind of investments really give the return? And then hopefully kind of alleviating and opening up from further investments. The reality is, one thing that I tell, and this is for everybody, right? Whether you're in marketing and tech and delivery, whenever I talk to anybody that's asking for funding, right? Whether it's, we want to hire a new person or we want to expand it to a specific region or scope of work, you should have a business case, right? Every single opportunity that you think or evaluate should have, what is the likely outcome and what is the likely impact. It doesn't mean that it has to be rocket science, right? Like you don't have to get it to the T. And of course, life happens. Things, right? You can't completely predict how a client or customer or team is really going to perform. but at least that gives you an idea of what it is that you're investing in, right? What it is that you want to spend on. And from there, you can have a conversation. I've always said, and this is a big principle of economy. Um, Funds aren't unlimited. I hope there was, that money tree that you could just continuously to pull out.
Exactly.
So a lot of the times in finance, it's about prioritizing, right? Knowing what it is that you want to prioritize, right? Based on different methodologies, right? You can do a return analysis, right? Understanding different opportunities and their return profiles. You can also see the scope and scale, right? Understand how big a project or a hire, right, really is, and what's their impact. Is their impact going to be in 3, 4, 6, 12 months, right? Like that's a little bit of the conversations that we're having whenever we think about, what is it and where is it that we want to invest in? Where is it that we have the opportunity? A lot of for us at this point, and this is something that I think we're all getting very aligned on, is we want to be customer centric, right? Customer first. So the idea here is whenever we're thinking about WiseLine and we're thinking about the future state is how can we position ourselves better to service that customer, right? How is it that we're able to unlock that additional revenue? How is it that we're able to kind of really become that valued partner that most of our customers really need, especially in a time where there's so much innovation, there's so much going on, right? If you read the news, I think
Yeah.
everybody and every single CEO, CFO, CTO is probably looking for advisors and hopefully good partners that are able to give them those insights.
Yeah, and right now that we have a lot of hype, let's say like that, with artificial intelligence, I think it's I think it's really challenging, especially in your position, to know what is a good investment and what is not a good investment, right? Because I'm sure that there are like 10 good ideas, but there are also like 10 ideas that are not going to work. So,
Yes, yes. I mean, and more than anything, and this is something, more a message to all of our Wiseliners, whether you're in tech delivery, right? Finance, legal. There's always the opportunity to test things out, right? We don't have to go all in from day one, right? And I think that's something that I think Ines, for example, is doing really good. The solutions team, the tech team with Chris, just thinking about, what are the POCs or what are the areas that we think might have, some sort of market penetration, and what is it that we, and right. And that's how you start kind of thinking through a business case. That's how you start hopefully prioritizing, right? When I talk about scale, right? Are we thinking about a $10,000 investment or $100,000 investment, right? Like what is it, what time and effort is it going to take in order to hopefully see whether or not those ideas are going to work out?
and what is some advice that you can give maybe on some important points that a business case should have, or that you would like that a project to have as
Yeah,
CFO? And
yeah.
or what kind of
So
mistakes do you see that you say they should include something like that or think like this?
yeah, I think the first of all is having a point, right? What is it that we want? What's the hypothesis, or what is it that we're trying to unlock? What's the goal, right? Thinking about, are we developing a new software, a new approach to a certain specific problem, right? That's basic, right? What is it that we're trying to solve for? Once you have that, think about what is it that you're going to need, right? And it's not just about the numbers. The numbers are extremely important, especially when we're thinking about costs, right? Like what's the money? What's the money behind? How much are we talking about? But think about what efforts is it going to take, right? How many resources you might need to be able to unlock something? How many people's time, right? Do we even have those resources? Is it something that, and a lot of times I think this is something that we've, experimented a little bit with some of our initiatives. Do we have resources on the bench, for example, right? People that could potentially, right, use some of that free time or spare time that they currently have to hopefully help develop. And that's something that I think we've gotten even better about doing, right? Not just thinking about, hey, do we need an expert? Do we need to hire externally to make this work? Or do we have our resources and we have capabilities internally that hopefully can help us at least get started and see whether or not this is going to kind of materialize? But I think, yeah, think about not just the money aspect, but think about the people aspect, right?
Very interesting. I agree. And another important point is, how do you prioritize innovation within the financial planning process? I think it's not easy. And we have seen examples of companies that, because they have a lot of money, they actually waste a lot. And one example that I have seen something similar in innovation is, for example, Google. Google has spent a lot of money in their self-driving car, or Apple. and Apple actually closed their project. So how do you actually prioritize innovation within financial process? How is that
Yeah,
done, especially when you're talking about a lot of money?
yeah, that's an amazing question. I mean, I would say Google and Apple are hopefully fortunate, right, to be able to. I used to have, and this is a true story, right? When I was actually back when I was kind of breaking away from investment banking, kind of um, moving into being in house, right? Like the finance department, kind of being more corporate side of finance. I interviewed with Amazon, and I remember something that stuck out to me back then, and this was 2016. No, this was 2019. Something that stuck out back then was that in one of my interviews, they really told me that Amazon, one of their core pillars was don't be afraid to spend. We have enough basically to throw away, kind of thing. And of course, some of those tech companies, I think that's a mentality. And the idea there is they basically were trying to, really incentivize this innovation at all costs or no matter what. Of course, these companies probably can't afford to do it, right? They have enough capital to be able to do that. And of course, if you look at the numbers, right, if you look at venture capital and venture capitals in general and historically, venture capital firms, for example, invest on 20 companies, then they just need one company to make it, right? So the other 19 are probably going to be a bust. And I think that's a little bit of the Amazon mentality. It's probably where, Apple, Google, those type of back then. I'm not completely sure that's the case nowadays. I think they've all slowly, they've declared a dividend. They've all slowly started to become more fiscally responsible. They've done their own right sizing efforts and stuff like that. So I think we're not anymore in that situation. I think for us at WiseLine, right, we're not. I mean, in realistic, we don't have or we can't afford to just throw away money, right? I think that makes us a little bit more strict and rigorous in our process when we're considering innovation, right? When we're considering what areas do we want. I think we, instead of, putting bets on 20, 30, 40 initiatives, we probably try to be very selective. And I think that helps us hopefully not only kind of avoid distraction, right? Because, a company like Google and Apple, they have the size, they have the scale, they have the people. We are still, we are about 1,500 employees globally. So we still have a little bit of not just a monetary constraint, but we have a people constraint, right? We want to make sure that our people are being productive and they're developing or hopefully dedicating their time in things that are hopefully worthwhile. One big advice, and this is something that I've kind of took to heart, was there's a concept in finance of sunk cost, right? So just because you've decided to do something and call it, a month, 2 months, 3 months down the road, it might not necessarily be what, or might not be materializing what you're thinking about. Do not be afraid to pull out, right? And I think that's probably where you're seeing Google and Apple, right? Like with some of these investments saying, hey, you know what? That's sunk cost. We've already spent it. Let's not continue to throw away money. Let's actually pull back, right? So give yourself a time frame whenever you're thinking about these type of investments, right? When is it that we want to accomplish that first, second, third milestone? And if you're not there, have that tough conversation with the team and understand, is this even worthwhile continuing? The money that you've already invested is money that you've already, and that's the sunk cost process concept. It shouldn't necessarily affect your go forward strategy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like you need to look forward, right? Like the past is not relevant to making, let's say, future decisions. And how do you have any tips on how to prioritize innovation? Like you have any rules, or do you study a lot of technology? Like how do you actually prioritize if you have five different
Yeah.
innovation things? How do you prioritize them?
So and this is at least from the finance side of it, right? Like I'm very process driven in some of the things that we do, right? It's not just about, the numbers, but it's also about the process of how we, the finance operations. One thing that I've told my team, and this is something, right? I've been at this role almost a year or two, since I took on the interim CFO role. But what I constantly repeat to my team is, if you want to innovate, think about first your pain points. What is it that really, bothers you, drags you, takes a lot of time when it doesn't really add value? And those are probably the types of things that you should start thinking about. How do we change it? How can we innovate to hopefully make it easier, faster, quicker, less painful, right? The reality is a lot of the go to market, when you think about successful products that have come to market, right, in general, they normally tap on that kind of some sort of pain, some sort of something that they try to solve for. Uber, for example, was that, right? I don't know if you've experienced this. I'm sure you have. Mexico City, stuff like that, big cities. But I remember New York City was such a pain to get a taxi. Like if you were on a street and you wanted to get a taxi because you didn't want to use the subway, you would get turned down. People would look at you, would ask you where you were going. They would literally like drive away. It was just like the most cumbersome and annoying process. So what happened? Uber comes along, and nowadays I would say, at least in New York City where I live, Uber probably dominates the market, right? Uber, Lyft, right? All these share car services. But it was because there was such a painful process to get on a cab or hopefully hail a taxi, that they were able to solve for that. But the same thing goes for, each and every one of us, right? We do our work. And of course, we've learned to do our work in some way, shape, or form, whether it was because we were taught in school, because we learned from our, managers, whatever. We were trained at work. But don't just assume that you should do something because it's how it's been done traditionally. Think about how is it that I can innovate, hopefully. And I would start with those type of processes, right? What is it that I can do better, quicker, faster that is currently either painful or, really taking up my time? Because I think those are the areas that you're going to see that it makes a big impact, whether it's in your work, in your customers' work, in your team, right? Collaboration. But I think you're going to see that value and that impact sooner rather than later, right? Of course, we all want to come up with, that next big idea, but that really, the next big idea comes in once in a year, once in a decade, right? Like you don't invent the iPhone every year. But when the iPhone was invented, great, that was a home run. That's like kind of like the lottery, right? Not everybody wins the lottery, everybody tries to play it, but sometimes don't focus on winning the lottery, right? Focus on what are the small improvements and how is it that I can hopefully kind of improve something that is,
I think that the role of a CFO in innovation is really important because you're actually, well, you're in charge of making really important financial decisions, right? So I
yes.
think if the CFO is, let's say, against innovation or doesn't know how to, or maybe doesn't know, no, but I don't know. I think it's a difficult position because if the CFO is always fighting, let's say, new projects or new technologies, I think it's going to be really challenging, right? And maybe that's some of the problem of some of the companies that I see that they don't change. It's really really difficult to see them change, right?
I agree. And one advice that I would say, right, as a CFO or as a finance partner in general, I mean, if I was, or hopefully if I'm a good CFO and a good finance partner, I have to acknowledge that I'm probably not going to be the technical tech expert, right? I'm not going to be the one that probably has, that view and that expertise when it comes to whether it's a software program, right? Like process, necessarily. My role here, hopefully, is to enable by challenging you, right? Challenging, whether it's technology delivery, right? Innovation, solutions, whatever the case may be, in understanding not just the idea, but trying to basically come up with what does that idea look like in reality, right? So my role mostly as a CFO is not necessarily to say yes or no, is to hopefully work with you in that building that business case, right? Being able to kind of come up with, is this feasible? Yes or no? What does it mean? Because a lot of times, and I've seen this, right? Visionaries and people that have, right, that are really more on the technical aspect, but on the technical, not finance, but more on like, technology, innovation, they come up with amazing ideas. Sometimes what they need is just that kind of partner that hopefully helps them, come up with the numbers, the business case, really come up with, what does good look like, and whether or not that's something that we should prioritize. So that I think in my approach, and it's fair to say, right, it's not just about us saying yes or no. It's more about hopefully you and whoever we're working with helping us understand what does good look like, and whether or not then based on that, should we or not pursue. But it should be a combined decision, right?
There's a really good advice, and I think that, yeah, you as a maybe in a different position that it's not finance, you should look to partner with finance or to learn how to create a business case. Don't look them as as your contender, but maybe as a partner that can help you build that business case. I think that's really good. Do you have any recommendations, maybe for people that don't know a lot about this? Where can they learn to build business cases? Maybe a book or a course or something.
Yeah. So actually, this is great timing. We are currently, a couple of us in e-staff are working on frameworks for business cases, right? We're currently considering various priorities and various projects, just initiatives, right? Some of them are short term, medium term, long term. But the idea here is hopefully, we're testing it out with some of the things that we're thinking about for WiseLine. But my advice, and this is something that it goes even beyond kind of innovation, right? Like, I think something that I do really want to reinforce here at WiseLine is that every one of our WiseLiners has insights, right? Whether it be insights about a process, whether it be insights about a customer, whether it be insights about opportunities. I think it's about hopefully enabling each and every one of us to be able to voice those insights and funnel them through the correct channels, right? And I say that in the best way possible, right? It's not about you need to go to your manager. Sometimes it's not about your manager. Sometimes, if you're in technology, it might be about raising your hand and telling, hey, delivery, I think I have this issue or problem or solution, right, that I'm able to kind of think through. I know that sometimes we sound like a broken record when we say, there's the referral program, stuff like that, hopefully but in the end, right, like if you're at the customer day in and day out, you know them better than anybody else, better than probably the client partner or the delivery partner, because you work with their teams. You see what their issues are. You see what their opportunities are. So with everything here at WiseLine, I just want us to have that kind of culture where hopefully we're able to raise our hand and say, hey, I've seen this, I've seen that, or this is an area that I think we should invite. And hopefully that will channel its way through and get you to that area where you're able to, sometimes either build a business case. I know this because I see it, especially with the tech leadership, right? They come up with really good ideas that I'm pretty sure, right? It comes off conversations with the technology team being able to say, hey, why don't we try this differently, right? I think that, the brain trust is another way of us hopefully voicing about, maybe not necessarily as many innovative ideas, but might be a little bit more cultural. But I think it's another forum for people to be able to raise their hand and say, hey, I think of XYZ. Why don't we test it out, or should we even consider it?
Very interesting. I think that's a really good initiative. Now, I want to go to another topic that I think is very relevant and also related to finance, and is recently I came across some studies indicating that a significant portion of the population in Spain had very low financial literacy levels. And I think that this replicates across many countries, although I didn't see other studies, for example, in the United States or in Latin America. And I think that is a very common problem, because you usually, like, people that don't study finance in the university usually never get exposed to that, or that studying, I don't know, music or law. And given this context, do you believe that companies like WiseLine should take the initiative to enhance the financial literacy of their own employees? And additionally, what do you think maybe the positive impacts of doing this in a company?
Yeah, no, I fully support, right, having companies really take the lead sometimes here and hopefully, and I mean, I say this knowing that, right, we all have our full-time jobs and we all have our, even sometimes when you get trainings, it seems a little bit cumbersome, but I do think, right, financial literacy is something that I think is essential and important for everybody, right? We all want to be able to do well in our lives, and we all want to be able to kind of, afford the lives that we want to afford for ourselves. And financial literacy is probably the first step to understanding, how do I get there from point A to point B? Here at WiseLine, I know, and sometimes I say we try to do a lot, and sometimes maybe it's not enough, but we started to do, right, like myself and Frank, we partnered and we tried to do a training, right, giving people the idea of thinking about, what does it mean to go from revenue to collected cash, right? What does it mean to actually, the reason why I think financial literacy is super important is because as the CFO, my goal is that each one of the WiseLiners treats the company's wallet as their own, right? And by that, what I mean, right, like whenever we're going out to dinners or we're going, we're going to go to a client visit, we want to be conscious about where we're spending, because even if it's not our own wallet, it's the company's wallet, but it should be treated as our own, right? We want WiseLine to do well. Having financial literacy hopefully helps that, right? People understanding what does it mean that I'm spending the company's money, but hopefully helps WiseLiners in their own personal life, right? Understanding, what is it that how should I structure my finances? Am I set up for success in retirement, right? There's a lot of different questions that I think a lot of times, and I see this, right? Like I used to volunteer with undergrads, and mostly it was giving them career coaching, and hopefully it was undergrads that didn't know anything about finance but were thinking about, I want to maybe consider a career in finance, but I don't know even when to start. And for me that was a really good project because it gave me the ability to kind of hopefully impart some of that knowledge. Even if they didn't choose to pursue a career in finance, I know they would learn a lot about what are cash flows and what does it mean for me, right? Like even in my personal life, what does debt, right? What does interest? There's a lot of different concepts that, are a little bit technical. They're not super hard to understand, especially on a beginner's, right? Like introductory level. But I think it is a little bit of the responsibility of each one of us, right? Like that have that knowledge to hopefully continue to impart. The same way that I'm hoping, right? Like right now we have an AI initiative here at WiseLine. We're hoping to kind of enable everybody to kind of be better versed. That's something that I'm taking, right, the opportunity to actually learn. So I do kind of incentivize each one of our WiseLiners whenever we have these sort of opportunities to kind of, get out of our comfort zone and learn something new, to definitely take the advantage. One thing that I do, and this is more personal, I've never had LinkedIn Learning, right? Paid LinkedIn Learning, any of my previous companies. WiseLine has it. And one thing that I've, and this I've been doing almost for 2 years, is that I try to go online, right? Like I go to LinkedIn Learning, and I pick a course and I set myself a goal. I want to do a course a month, right? That means that in a year, I'm hopefully learning about 12 different subjects. Some of them are soft skills, right? I've done the people management courses in LinkedIn, but I've also started to do a little bit of the AI stuff, right? Like I'm trying to understand, I'm not super versed, right? My background is not in computer science. I probably struggle with having a basic conversation when it comes to here, but we have some of those benefits and tools here at WiseLine that I think we should all be taking advantage. And again, this is the same thing about, growing up. I remember my dad would almost force me to read a book. I wasn't a great reader. I prefer watching TV but once you get into the habit and you set yourself a goal, a realistic goal, and you do it for 1, 2, 3 weeks, all of a sudden you start noticing that it comes more natural. So that's how I set myself up for LinkedIn Learning, right? When I joined, I said, I want to be able to take this advantage. I know for a fact that I'm the CFO. It's a very expensive license. So we should all be taking the advantage that it's a benefit, and hopefully, taking, and sometimes, right, to your point, if finance is something that you're curious about, there's a lot of really good courses even on LinkedIn Learning, right? That you can at least start getting, that concept down.
I think that's really interesting, and yeah, I also like to learn. I like to listen to a lot of audiobooks, I think, and podcasts. I think that's a really easy way to learn, especially if you feel like you don't have a lot of time to just sit down and read. And I think that's really important. I remember that a while ago you taught or gave a little talk about how the finances inside WiseLine worked. And I think it was really, really good because actually people, myself included, I didn't really know how everything worked. And I think that's important to really understand how to make better decisions about the company because, as you say, financial literacy is important for your own life. So I think that if you make better financial decisions, you're going to be better off. So I think that's going to mean a better employee, happier employee also. But also, you have to make financial decisions at work, even if you are not the CFO, even if you are a software engineer or a manager or in, human resources. You're going to have to make those kind of decisions, and it's really important. And like I think that it's important to understand that because sometimes people try to make decisions or don't really understand why some decisions are made financially, and just want a raise or something. And maybe if they could understand better the process and the financial process, they could understand or on how to improve those things without hurting the company. Because uh, you see that all the time. Yeah, I used to work on an airline, and I remember that the pilots that time wanted a raise, and they basically almost bankrupt the company, basically.
Yeah.
So I think that's important, to really understand how the finances work, and also to think, okay, we want to improve our, let's say, our salaries, how that can be done, maybe, right? I think that's like
Yep.
an important thing, and something that I have learned a little bit. And also one thing that it's a recurring topic in this podcast, and I think it's very useful, is topics related to careers. And I think that, well, you have a really impressive career, so it's going to be really cool to learn from you in this aspect. What was the biggest challenge that you faced while building your career, and how did you overcome that difficulty?
This is a really good question. Um, so for me, I think, and I'm going to go back to my days as an analyst in investment banking. I had an MD at UBS where I started my career, who I remember when he did hit my first kind of full year review, right? In banking, it was very formal. You would sit down in your MD's office, and they would kind of read out your pros, your cons, stuff like that. And then they would tell you, what your bonus was. It was, kind of a nerve wracking experience, especially the first time when you're 22 years old and you're having to sit in front of this man that has, I don't know, 20, 30 years of experience. And you see as kind of, this kind of very senior person. But I remember after we got out, the awkward part, right, of him having to read kind of a HR or people prompt almost conversation. We started having a conversation more about careers, and he started giving me advice. And I think the hardest thing that I've ever faced um, is, especially earlier mid year of your career, right, where I see myself still, is not being complacent. And by that I mean, he told me, and his advice back then was, look, he had been at UBS at that point. I think it was over 20 years. His career almost spanned 30 years of investment banking, right? He was a career banker. He had done it since undergrad. Good for him. But what he told me back then was like, look, I've been at UBS for 20 years. That does not mean that every 2 to 3 years I take a look at the market, right? I take a look at what opportunities are out there. Just because I know I've become good and probably at this point have built a reputation in our book of business with, clients and stuff like that, does not mean that I'm, kind of relax and kind of go with the flow. And that's something that for me, I think stuck really hard, right?
And
Especially early.
was there a moment where you feel stuck in your career?
I don't think there was necessarily a moment that I felt stuck. I do think there have been times, right, where you think you've hit a little bit of a ceiling and you've said, hey, am I going to be growing in this company? Is there an opportunity for continued growth? Even more importantly, and this is, when I decided to leave banking, the decision there wasn't about me feeling stuck or feeling like, I didn't have room to grow. I had a really successful career in banking. I was no longer promoted. I was promoted early, right? I ended up always being ranked at the top of my class. So I was good at what I was doing. The tough part there was realizing that I wasn't necessarily passionate about what I was doing. And I think that's where you have to come to realize, right? Come to terms with yourself and be honest, not just do something because you've been doing it and doing it well, not just do something because it's, kind of right. And I say this because back then it was a very daunting task to finally, after almost a decade, to tell myself, say, hey, am I going to have to restart from scratch? Like, what does this look like, right? What does this branching path? But you of course, sometimes it's a gamble and you roll the dice. But for me, I think it worked out, right? I was able to really break out, and sure, and I'm honest, right? Like banking pays well, so it wasn't just that I was good at it, but that was rewarded
Yeah,
fairly
yeah.
well.
It was like you had a, how to say it, like in finance, like the opportunity cost, right? Like it was hard for
Yes.
you because they paid really well in finance. So where are you going to find someone like a better opportunity, right? That's the opportunity cost.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I think that was probably one of the most challenging moments. It was also one of the most scary moments, probably, in my career, because I
And
was,
and what do you recommend to someone that's maybe having that dilemma that you had? Like, yeah,
yeah.
I'm successful. I'm in an industry that pays really well, but uh, that there's no passion, or I don't know how to say it, but maybe yeah, you know,
Yeah.
not where
I
you're
think
passionate.
the work wasn't necessarily rewarding for me, or at least wasn't aligned, with what I was good at it and I was doing it, but it wasn't necessarily something. I think one thing that, and by the way, I think this will happen to probably most people at some point in their careers, right? I think younger generations, probably earlier, right? I think, at least for me, right? My father's generation, they would kind of stick to a career. They would probably be at a company for 20, 30 years and retire from that first job. I don't think that's necessarily the case for my generation. I think when I look and I see kind of the people that are coming next, I think they're probably going to be experiencing similar stuff. So my advice, one, is don't be afraid, right? Be honest, be true to yourself. Don't be afraid. And then if you have a good network, whether that be of friends, of family, right? Networks of coworkers that you've had, don't be afraid to have conversations, right? For me, one thing that really helped was I, of course, had friends that had done banking, had left earlier. I also had friends that had never been banking and might have done, finance right out of undergrad. I had my business school friends where some of them were teachers, marketeers. They were coming from different worlds. And I took the opportunity, once I realized that I wanted to see or look for change, I started to just do my own research, right? It's not that you just blindly jump and say, hey, hopefully I land, but start having those conversations and understand, what is it that they do? What is it that they, like? What is it that they don't like about their roles? And start kind of thinking, do I see myself doing those type of roles, doing the research, right? Just because or a person has decided that they want to switch careers or want to do something different doesn't mean that you do it overnight. Recruiting also takes time. So build that pipeline of, opportunities and kind of make sure that they're aligned. And then one big piece here, and this is something, I've seen people do, especially when they're unhappy with their work, don't just take the first job or the first role that comes around, right? Don't jump for the sake of jumping, right? Be critical for yourself. For me, it was a little bit scarier because I wasn't 20 something when I made the decision. I was already in my 30s, which meant that I had, a career under me. I wanted to be thoughtful and strategic. So maybe it was a little bit more risky, and that's why I probably took a little bit more of time to actually figure it out.
Well,
But again, nothing happens overnight. And the best thing, or hopefully, is that you still have a job, right? Like if you're looking for that change, you still have that income, you hopefully have that job, and you're still, you're making do with what you have. Your priorities might change a little, but and recruiting takes time. That is the one thing that I have to say is I had forgotten what recruiting was like, and all of a sudden, having three or four multiple
that's
interviews.
pretty challenging. Yeah, well,
Yes.
Alfredo, thank you for sharing that great story. I think it's going to be really helpful for everyone. And another question that I have is, can you share your top three rules for success?
Yes. Okay. My first one, what I would say is uh, align yourself with something that you're good at, right? And the reason I say this is there's both, success, or at least for me, success. There's two folds. One is, of course, you can be hard worker and you can put in the time, and that's extremely important. But we also have our natural inclinations, right? I, for one, can be very upfront. I am not very creative. So a career that demanded me to be creative was probably not in the cards for me. Doesn't mean that I don't like to be creative, right? Doesn't mean that I don't, have my hobbies. But that wasn't necessarily going to be something that I was going to be good at or much less excel at, even if I put in a lot of time, right? Like, I think that's the first one. The second thing, do something that you like or that you're passionate about. And I can tell you this right now, right? I said before, in banking, I was doing 100, 120 hours, right, in investment banking. Nowadays, I'm probably doing 100 hours as a CFO. The difference there is I am not resentful now that I'm a CFO because I like what I'm doing, right? So it doesn't feel like a burden, or it doesn't feel like, that I'm a heavy lift that I have to do. I feel like I'm doing the work, I see the impact, and I feel happy or rewarded for it. And I think that does really align. And then the third really big thing is surround yourself with people that will help you or will help lift you up, right? And by that I mean, it's always good to have a network of friends, coworkers, mentors that are hopefully, whatever. Because the reality is, and this happens, I learned this early on in my career in banking, is you learn on the job, right? As much as we love education and we go to school and, universities, there's a lot of things that you don't learn there that you learn on the job. And having that network of people that hopefully you can ask questions about whenever you're not feeling too sure about something, or you can, I used to remember when I started, in some of, when I started doing a lot more client facing kind of work, I would have friends even like proofread my emails to customers, right? Like make sure to say, hey, does this sound right? Like a second pair of eyes. There was a really big rule that I learned in banking was whoever does the work shouldn't be checking it, right?
That's a good
And
point.
I do this right now, Pao and my team, we have this golden rule. We're a very small team on the finance side. But of course, whenever I do the work, I have her check it. And whenever she does the work, I have, I'm the one that checks it, because the reality is, sometimes you miss your own mistakes, right? And having that network of friends and coworkers and mentors is super key for you to hopefully be successful.
Perfect. And we don't have that much time, so the last two questions, Alfredo, and is what is the most valuable career advice that you have ever received, or maybe that you have?
Yeah. I'll go back to my MD conversation. I think that's
That
been,
one.
and I say this all the time. I think, you know, reassessing where you're at on, maybe it doesn't have to be every year, right? But like every 2 to 3 years, making sure that you're not becoming complacent, I think is key for your continued growth, especially early on in your career, right? I want to make sure to say, right, like, because what ends up happening, I've seen this, is people that have been in the same job for 5, 10, 20 years, they might not necessarily be challenged, and they're not necessarily proactively looking for that challenge. It doesn't mean that you're going to change companies. It doesn't mean that you're going to change roles, but sometimes about raising your hand and say, hey, I feel like I've learned what I can here. Is there anything extra or any additional responsibilities that I'm able to take? Is there anything that I can help with, right? It goes as far as being able to say that, just raising your hand and saying, hey, I want to learn something new, or I want to be challenged, and continuously doing that, because that's only going to make you hopefully more developed, a better professional, right? So definitely don't become complacent, and every so often kind of check yourself, and make sure that you're constantly growing, learning, and developing.
Really good advice. I really like that about reassessing every 2 or 3 years and really reflecting, because sometimes we just, as they say, go with the flow, and then
Yes.
the problems. If you don't, if you don't think about things, that it's just like accumulating debt. Let's say like that, and
Mm-hmm.
later on you're gonna pay it. And the finally, do you have any message or that you want to give to people that work at WiseLine
Yeah.
as a CFO?
I mean, yes. So, and I will hopefully be addressing you all soon at the town hall, but what I want to say is, we want each and every one of us, right? Every single WiseLiner to be really, right now, what we're trying to do is be customer centric. So I think really keeping in mind, whenever you're doing something, whenever you're spending time, think about, how does this benefit a customer, right? How does this benefit the company? How does it benefit? Each one of us is really responsible for the company. I think that's the most important thing that we can hopefully walk away with, no matter your role, no matter your level, no matter where you're located, right? What office, region, each one of us is a WiseLiner. Each one of us is hopefully responsible for the brand, the values, right? Everything that goes, the image of what WiseLine is, not just kind of, right, my role, my responsibility. And I say this because I think, let's always keep that in mind, that we are WiseLiners no matter where we're at, and that we hopefully are vested in the success of the company. So for me as a CFO, right, I think it's super important. And I say this because I see, sometimes there's always this thought process, well, someone more senior, and this might not necessarily be my scope of work. The reality is all of us, right, like should have that role and responsibility of knowing that we can drive WiseLine forward and we can hopefully continue to make it a better, bigger, more amazing place to work.
Thank you, Alfredo, for that message. And well, we reached the end of this episode. And I want to thank you for your time. I know it's very valuable as a CFO. And I really hope that people learn a lot about finance and your role, because I think it's important to understand other roles in a company to have a broader perspective. And I think that understanding finance is really important, especially if you are not in finance. So
Yeah.
thank you very much, Alfredo, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And it was a pleasure. So hopefully we continue to do these more often, but I like it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
The same. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the audience. And if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. Thank you.